Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today we're going to tackle something kind of heavy, but really important. It's something that I think has been on a lot of our minds. How do democracies, ones that seem pretty solid, how do they start to drift towards authoritarianism? And for this deep dive, we're going to be looking at Michael Moore's documentary, Fahrenheit 119. Now, this film, it definitely pushes some buttons. It's meant to be provocative, right? But it makes us think about some uncomfortable things about America's politics.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting how Moore uses Trump's win in 2016
Oh, yeah.
as like the starting point.
Yeah.
He really captures that like shock and disbelief, like those election night maps.
Yeah.
Everyone's watching those maps and they're slowly turning red.
Yeah. No one expected it.
It was against all expectations.
Yeah.
But the thing is, he goes deeper than just the shock.
Yeah, because we all felt that. I mean, it was a gut punch. But the film seems to be saying, like, hold on, this wasn't just some random thing. It's like he's arguing that the stage was already set for someone like Trump. Like, this had been building for decades.
Yeah, and think about some of the things Wartone points to, like growing inequality in the economy, local journalism disappearing, and the media just feeding on outrage.
Right.
These things, they didn't just happen overnight. They created this environment, this perfect environment where someone like Trump could come in, someone who knew exactly how to tap into those anxieties and fears and just thrive.
Oh, absolutely. And you can't ignore how Trump just completely mastered the media. It was almost like he weaponized it. Like in the film, there are those scenes where he's literally like directing the cameras during his speeches, He was dictating the terms of interviews, making entire networks wait for hours. It's crazy.
It's brilliant in a way, but also kind of terrifying, right?
Oh, absolutely.
He understood that in today's media world, it's not about substance. It's about controlling the story. Even if the story is just spectacle and outrage, that's what matters.
Yeah.
He basically went around the traditional media and straight to the audience. Created his own reality show, basically.
And it worked, didn't it? It's like what Moore's saying is that this whole obsession with spectacle, with getting those viral moments, it's actually hurt our ability to have real, meaningful conversations about politics.
It has.
We're so overloaded with information, and a lot of it is intentionally misleading, that it's getting harder and harder to figure out what's actually true.
It's like we've become addicted to the drama, the outrage, always waiting for that next breaking news alert.
Always.
And that creates the perfect space for manipulation.
Yeah.
For someone like Trump to come in and say, forget the facts, just trust your gut, trust me.
And that leads us to this idea of, real America. Moore keeps coming back to this. He argues that on a lot of issues, things like abortion rights, protecting the environment, even just legalizing marijuana, most Americans actually lean left,
But it makes you ask, who gets to decide what real America even means? Because Moore's film shows us that this term, politicians use it all the time, right? They want to evoke this sense of nostalgia of shared values, but it can be a really dangerous tool.
Oh, yeah, because it creates this us versus them mentality, right? It's like there's this one group that represents the true America.
Right.
And if you don't agree with them, you're somehow an outsider. That kind of talk is super divisive.
It is.
And it's been used throughout history to justify all sorts of awful policies.
Exactly. Think about the historical parallels here.
Yeah.
This idea of a pure, perfect nation that needs to be protected from outside forces, we've seen that before.
We have.
Used to justify everything from segregation to keeping immigrants out.
And Moore, he doesn't hesitate to call out the Democratic Party, too.
He doesn't.
His critique of them is pretty harsh. He basically argues that they've become so obsessed with winning elections that they've completely lost sight of their own values. And alienated their own base.
Yeah, he really goes after Bill Clinton's presidency.
Oh, yeah.
Argues that Clinton embracing those traditionally Republican policies,
Like what kinds of policies?
things like deregulation, mass incarceration, that actually paved the way for someone like Trump to come in.
It's like setting the stage, almost.
It is.
And then there's that whole part about the Democratic National Committee trying to undermine Bernie Sanders' campaign back in 2016.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that was some pretty damning stuff. And it just feeds this feeling that the whole system is rigged against anyone who tries to challenge the establishment.
Right. What Moore's getting at is this. The Democratic Party, in trying to appeal to this mythical center, they've actually abandoned the very people who should be their biggest supporters.
Wow.
And that creates this vacuum. A vacuum of disillusionment, of anger that someone like Trump can easily step into and exploit.
And nowhere is that feeling of betrayal and disillusionment more obvious than in the story of Flint, Michigan.
Oh, yeah.
This is where the film gets really dark. We go from these big political arguments to the actual human cost of political corruption and neglect.
The Flint water crisis, it's just heartbreaking.
It is.
It's this awful example of how people in power can fail to protect those who are most vulnerable.
Yeah.
And it goes beyond just contaminated water. It's about a system that lets those in power escape any accountability, while the people who are suffering, they're left with nothing.
You see these families struggling with the health problems, the economic decline, the betrayal by their own government. It's like, if this can happen in Flint, could it happen anywhere?
Oh, absolutely. Flint becomes this microcosm of all the larger forces at work. It shows how the erosion of trust, silencing dissent, concentrating power, all of those things create the perfect conditions for authoritarianism, even in a country that thinks of itself as democratic.
So we've got this backdrop: growing inequality, media that thrives on outrage, a political system that feels increasingly out of touch with everyday people. It's a pretty bleak picture. But more, he doesn't leave us completely without hope.
He doesn't.
He points to these grassroots movements that are emerging, these little pockets of resistance, these glimmers of light in the darkness. And that's what we're going to dive into when we come back for part 2.
Yeah, picking up on that thread of hope, it's interesting how Moore puts these really dark, almost dystopian things right next to these moments of resistance.
It is.
It's like he's saying, look, things are bad, but look at what people can do when they fight back.
And he doesn't just focus on the big stuff, like the Women's March or the Parkland protests, right?
I hate
He
that.
shows these smaller acts of defiance, too.
Yeah.
Like the teachers in West Virginia going on strike, and they're wearing those red bandanas,
Yeah.
which is a direct connection to those coal miner struggles.
Yeah, there's something powerful about reclaiming those symbols of, working class solidarity.
Oh.
It taps into this historical memory,
Yeah.
reminds us that ordinary people have always had the power to stand up to authority.
And it's not just about symbols either. Moore actually gets into the nitty-gritty of how these movements gain traction.
Yeah.
He shows us how they use social media to organize, how they build these coalitions across different groups, how they actually put pressure on politicians through direct action and civil disobedience.
It's like a masterclass in grassroots organizing.
It is.
And it feels really relevant right now with so many people feeling disillusioned with politics. It shows that you don't have to wait for the establishment to give you permission to make a difference.
Yeah.
You can create your own power.
One of the things that really struck me was how Moore connects these seemingly different movements. You've got teachers in West Virginia, students in Parkland, Black Lives Matter activists, and he ties them all together through this shared demand for accountability from those in power.
Yeah, it's like a reminder that even though these issues might look different on the surface, they're all connected. They're all symptoms of a system that's rigged to benefit the wealthy and powerful.
At the expense of everyone else.
Exactly.
And that brings us back to the 2016 election and the Democratic Party's role in all of this. Moore really doesn't hold back in his criticism of the party establishment.
He doesn't.
He argues that their complacency, their disconnect from their base, is what paved the way for Trump.
Yeah, he highlights these specific moments, like when Democratic leaders tried to pressure progressive candidates.
Oh, yeah.
Like Levi Tillman in Colorado, to drop out of their races.
Saying that they weren't viable.
Exactly. It shows this tension within the party,
Yeah.
between those who want to keep things the same and those who want real change.
It makes you wonder, what does it even mean to be a Democrat today?
Right.
Is it enough to just be not Trump? Or do we need to rethink the party's values, its priorities, like from the ground up?
Moore seems to be saying that real change won't come from the top down. It has to come from the people. From grassroots activism that forces the party to confront its own flaws and embrace a more progressive agenda.
And the story of Flint becomes so crucial here.
It does.
It's not just about a local environmental disaster. It's about the failure of government at every level to protect its citizens.
The way Governor Snyder's administration basically took over Flint, they installed this unelected emergency manager who only answered to the governor.
Yeah.
It's scary how easily democratic processes can be undermined like that.
And it's not just Flint either. Moore connects this to this bigger trend of disenfranchisement, especially in Black and brown communities.
Absolutely. He shows how things like voter ID laws, gerrymandering, gutting the Voting Rights Act, all of that makes it harder for these communities to have a voice.
It's almost like a deliberate strategy.
It is. It's a strategy to silence the people who are most likely to challenge the status quo.
Wow.
And it reminds us that the fight for democracy, it's not over.
Yeah, it's an ongoing thing.
It's not something we won back in the 18th century and can just forget about.
Yeah. And while the film definitely doesn't shy away from the role of race and racism,
Yeah.
it also doesn't oversimplify things, you know?
It doesn't.
It acknowledges that class, geography, culture, all of those things contribute to the political climate we're in.
One of the things that makes Fahrenheit 119 so powerful is that it doesn't give us easy answers
It doesn't.
or point fingers at just one person or group. It forces us to look at the hard truths about our society and our own part in creating the systems that got us here.
So now we're left with this big question. What can we do about it? Moore shows us these glimmers of hope, these acts of resistance.
Right.
But is it enough to actually turn things around? That's what we're going to explore when we come back for the final part of our deep dive. So we spent the last 2 parts of this deep dive really digging into Michael Moore's Fahrenheit 119.
Yeah.
And it's been, well, a lot to take in, but important, you know? We've seen how things like complacency, political maneuvering, and a media that loves outrage, it all creates this breeding ground for authoritarianism, even in a democracy.
Yeah, but remember, it's not all doom and gloom.
Right.
The film also shows us how powerful ordinary people can be when they resist.
They can.
So the question is, what does that resistance actually look like? What can we, like as individuals, do to push back against this erosion of democratic values?
Yeah.
How do we build a better future?
Right. Moore gives us these examples like the teacher strike, the Parkland students, the rise of people like AOC. But how do we actually take those examples and like turn them into action in our own lives?
Well, Moore keeps saying how important it is to be engaged, at every level. Like, it's not just about voting for president every 4 years.
Right.
It's about local politics, town hall meetings, holding our elected officials accountable.
It's about staying informed, too.
Yeah. Not just passively taking in whatever news we're given.
Yeah.
We have to actually seek out different perspectives, question the narratives, and think critically.
Absolutely. And being willing to challenge things, even when it's uncomfortable.
Right. Think about it. The people who've really made a difference, like the civil rights activists, the suffragettes, labor organizers, back then they were seen as radical, disruptive.
Yeah.
They spoke truth to power, even when it meant facing consequences.
But it's not always about these grand gestures, right?
Right,
Like, you don't have to become a full-time activist.
No.
It can be smaller things, like having those tough conversations with family and friends who might not agree with us,
Wow.
supporting organizations that reflect our values,
Right.
even being aware of what we buy, you know? Our choices as consumers can make a difference.
Absolutely. And one thing that really stuck with me from the film was Moore's focus on community.
Oh, yeah.
He shows how those movements, those grassroots movements, are built on shared values, solidarity, supporting each other.
Because at the end of the day, fighting for a better future isn't about one hero.
No, it's not.
It's about collective action. It's about realizing that we're all connected and our fates are tied together.
And that's such a powerful message, especially now when there are so many things trying to divide us by race, by religion, by political party.
It is power.
It reminds us that our strength is in our unity,
Yeah.
in bridging those divides and working together.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Fahrenheit 119, I'm feeling, well, a lot of things. There's a sense of urgency for sure. Like, we have to recognize the very real threats to democracy.
Do.
But I also feel hope. Like, we do have the power to change things.
We do.
More challenges us, right? Will we just give in to apathy and despair, or will we step up and become the change makers our society needs?
A big question.
It is. And I think the answer lies within each of us. It's a choice we make every single day, in big ways and small ways. It's a choice to engage, to resist, to believe that a better world is possible, and to fight for it.
That's the message of Fahrenheit 119, isn't it?
I think so. It's a call to action, a reminder that we create the future.
We do. We create it together.
Thanks for joining us on this Deep Dive.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
We hope this conversation has gotten you thinking and inspired you to take action. Even the smallest act of courage, the smallest act of resistance can make a difference. And together, we can build a future that we can all be proud of.